So before we get started, one thing I wanted to bring up is both Subscribestar and Patreon. Now at this point I've largely just had those services available for people to use as tip jars. But now I'm going to chill them a little bit. As you guys have noticed, I've brought on an editor to do these reviews because between, my day job, plus streaming on Twitch, plus all the other stuff I've got going on, including comic book production, I just do not have the time to sit down in front of Sony Vegas and edit a long-form review anymore. And I honestly don't want to just do commentary videos because they're not as fun as these reviews, to be honest with you. So the reason I bring this stuff up is because, as you've noticed, I brought on the editor Shirt Lad, and he has done an excellent job with these videos so far. So when it comes to Subscribestar and Patreon, you're going to notice that if you go to those pages that I have updated the tiers on them to have basically a couple that have very specific purposes. So one thing that I would ask is that if you dig this content, consider signing up for either one of those. You'll get your name in the credits of every single video as long as you're a consistent subscriber. Plus, you'll get other bonuses as well if you give a little bit more a month. Alright, anyway, let's go ahead and get on with the show. So, I wanted to start a series on the 1-year war in Gundam, which would essentially review the entirety of the Gundam shows that take place during that time period. That includes the original show, the 08th MS Team, MS Igloo, Gundam Thunderbolt, and finally 0080 War in the Pocket. There's just one problem. I'm kind of in the midst of rewatching them, and I'm not done yet. So instead of going through Gundam today, we're going to switch to a different mecha show. One that you may not have heard of, that's a little bit rough around the edges, but is both historically significant in the anime world and is incredibly unique in how it's put together. To explain what I mean about that, though, I need to bring up a diagram here. Or rather, Shirt Dude has to bring up a diagram here. But anyway, in the world of mecha, there are primarily two types of mecha shows. Here on the left, we have the Super Robot Show. These particular shows are fairly soft sci-fi that treat the giant robots like superheroes. Heck, if you don't believe me on the superhero bit, let's do a little bit of a visual example. Let's have a look at the original Getter 1 from the original Getter Robo. Cape out and everything, right? Well, notice how his cape and colors on his outfit come together. Now let's look at Superman and Batman. Now let's just look at Batman, especially Batman. Let's compare the two right now. Yeah, you notice the similarities? I rest my case. Anyway, generally speaking, the robots from these shows tend to be massive behemoths that fight kaiju, alien invaders, or other giant-sized robots in weekly adventures. If you want the textbook examples of this, you've got Mazinger Z and Getter Robo's TV shows. I make the distinction because the manga for both is much darker. Plus shows like The Braves, with some good examples being Brave Express Mike Gine or Brave Police Jadecker. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, the right side of the spectrum, we have The Real Robot Show. These particular shows tend to be military dramas or even descend into horror. These shows are considerably more grounded in their approach and tend to feature much darker subtext and deal with more mature themes. Primary examples of this are obviously Mobile Suit Gundam, which popularized the genre, Super Dimension Fortress Macross, Armored Trooper Votoms, and Full Metal Panic, among others. Now, exceptions to the rules exist. Don't type that comment, I see you there. And some things that are in the mecha genre tend to actually spin off into being their own thing. Blue Gender and Getter Robo Armageddon integrate body horror and horror themes in general to be their own thing on top of being Real Robot and Super Robot shows respectively. Neon Genesis Evangelion in a lot of ways is a super robot show in its formula, but it deconstructs the super robot genre by integrating many of the real robot approaches used by Yoshiyuki Tamino in the original Gundam. What you end up getting is something that's one part Mazinger, one part Altered States, and one part H.P. Lovecraft, and it feels like David Lynch dipped his feet into the anime pool. Speaking of Yoshiyuki Tamino, though, He created 2 shows after Gundam that are a space opera and a fantasy, plus being a mecha. For the space opera, you have Heavy Metal Elgime. By the way, for those of you who hate modern Star Wars, but you want the itch scratched in the meantime, watch Heavy Metal Elgime. It's basically if Tamino got to do a Star Wars story, which is obviously one of his biggest inspirations. Now with Aura Battler Dunbine, it's as if you took an isekai and a mecha and combined it. I'm only 10 episodes into it and I need to start it again, but it's a great freaking show. I mean, unlike most isekai, it's actually good. Anyway, as I've established, the mecha genre is ridiculous when it comes to versatility. And I feel the need to bring up the diagram again. So we have a scale from right to left, left to right. So there's got to be a middle point, right? Well, yeah, there is. And there is a show that is emblematic of what that middle point is. And that show in particular is the subject of today's review. Super Beast Machine God Dancouga. Is that a mouthful? Yes, so we're just going to shorten it down to Dancouga. And by the way, it's not Dancougar. The mech literally has its name spelled to activate its combination mode, and there's no R. But yes, Dancouga is literally in the center of our little diagram. When you look at Dancouga, the mech itself, it looks like a super robot. It's massive. It's a combiner, sort of like the Megazord or Voltron. But Dancouga is not like a super robot story. In fact, it's a full-on war chronicle that covers some very dark moments and full-on war crimes from the invading force. This sets it apart from a lot of other super robot shows and honestly plants it right in the center. It's basically like if Voltron was heavy fucking metal, down to everybody's awesome 80s hair. But anyway, if you like super robot shows and giant robots smashing the bad guy of the week, that's here. If you like war stories with tough decision-making and character complication, that is also here. Okay, let's go ahead and get into the show itself. The story primarily centers on Ben Shapiro betraying the Earth and helping an alien race take it over. That is 100% a joke. You stop typing that comment. I see you there. This video does not exist for your political rants. I don't care how mad Steven Crowder is. Just no, this is about sci-fi. Stop it! The villain's real name is Shapiro, though. Shapiro Keats. At the beginning of the show, our hero, Shinobu, is stationed at a pilot training base in Australia, where Shapiro is one of the bigwigs. He's currently dating the lovely Sarah Yuki, another pilot at the base, along with Shinobu, who's arguably one of the coolest hairstyles for a woman in any anime I've ever seen. Plus, she's just a great overall character. Anyway, Shapiro, on the other hand, is a fucking megalomaniac, which shows that Sarah clearly doesn't have much taste in men. Anyway, the instant that the Earth is invaded by an alien force called the Muga Empire, Shapiro defects to try and be on the winning team. Sarah also attempts to defect with him, but Shinobu cripples her aircraft, stopping her. From here, humanity loses badly in the opening salvo of the conflict, with most of the planet being taken over. However, in Japan, they seem to have an answer to the problem, because this is anime. Specifically, they have an organization called the Cyber Beast Force. Shinobu and Sarah are joined by the young pilot Masato Shikibu and martial artist Ryo Shiba to pilot 4 beast machines that are absurdly powerful and capable of handling just about any issue that these invaders could send their way. Later on in the show, they find out that their machines can combine into one larger robot called Dancouga, which when you see what this thing can do, you can see why they call it a machine god. Now, before we get into the skinny about what happens during the show, we need to talk about why it's so notable, at least historically speaking. You see, this show was the debut of the legendary animator Masami Obari. Does the name not ring a bell? Well, let me drop a couple of names that sound very familiar. Actually, no, scratch that. We're just going to drop one name. Terry Bogard. That's right, this is the guy who directed the Fatal Fury films. He's also done other mecha and character design on several different anime, and even directed the fight scenes for Mobile Suit Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans, which is why they're so good. He's also known for what's called the Obari pose. Now, have you ever seen an anime where they take a low-angle shot of our hero holding their sword or gun out from near their pelvic area? You're seeing it on screen right now. That is the Obari pose, and it's easily the most famous shot used to emphasize that there is a very big, very important, devastating weapon on the screen. That of the pilot of the machine is compensating for something. Okay, back to the show itself. So, Dancouga, as I mentioned, is the logical midpoint between the real robot and super robot genres. It takes elements from both equally, but still ends up being something completely unique. Given the fact that the show focuses on an alien invasion, it doesn't really seem like it's trying to parrot any one particular show that came before it. Not to mention, it's a nice twist for the main villain of the show to have a personal connection to two of the pilots in the Cyber Beast Force. It gives a sense of stakes and tension where you don't really know which direction the show is going to go when it comes to your particular main characters. When you've got Sarah, who is obviously very deeply in love with Shapiro, and isn't exactly comfortable talking about that fact that her former lover is a traitor. Shinobu doesn't really want to put her in that position either, because he knew both of them before all of this. This keeps everybody else in the dark, but Shinobu's fully aware that if he were to let slip about who defected, there would be a ton of skepticism placed on Sarah, even though she's completely loyal to the Cyber Beast Force and humanity as a whole. To be honest, the characterization in this show is probably its strongest suit. All of the characters in this show feel very human. They have easy to understand backgrounds that just about anybody could identify with in one way or another. Not to mention, both the enemy organization and the Cyber Beast Force are ran like militaries. The Muga Empire doesn't just kill off its generals for failing like some cartoonish organization that would pull the lever cronk and let them fall into a pit. When a military leader in the show is unable to perform his duties, the Emperor simply sends them on leave, instead of some grandiose public execution or something that would be really bombastic and over the top. As for the Cyber Beast Force, it's essentially what's left of the Earth's military. Much of the show has our lead characters going out to liberate places from alien control, or simply try to support local resistances. On top of that, this is not a clean war. The aliens are more than happy to kill civilians or soldiers and will use tactics like weapons of mass destruction against their enemies. If brute force isn't enough, they'll use psychological warfare as well. They're not above torturing prisoners or mind-controlling people into killing one another to achieve their goals. These elements allow for a very grounded show that honestly feels like you're watching a war drama that just happens to have giant robots that look like animals. Now, I need to talk about the technical aspects of the show. It has a great soundtrack. I think that goes without saying. It's an 80s anime, and there's a lot of great 80s animes that have great soundtracks. The character designs are also 80s as fuck, but I like that. And then the mecha design is great, but then again, this is Obari we're talking about. But overall, just 80s era futurism just fucking looks cool. The voice acting on this one is actually really good too, with the Japanese cast really bringing it in regards to the emotional weight of every situation. Shinobu, our main protagonist, is voiced by Kazuki Yao. If the name doesn't sound familiar, he's the voice of my favorite Gundam pilot in the Universal Century. Yep, he's motherfucking Judo Ashita, pilot of the Gundam Double Zeta. Trust me, at some point we're going to talk Double Zeta. We're going to have some fun with that one. I fucking love that show. Anyway, Kazuki is the type of VA who puts all of himself into a performance and has a lot of fun with it, which really showed here. Heck, all four of the Cyber Beast pilots have very fiery temperaments in one way or another, so the fact that they've got that sort of emotional weight and punch in their voices really comes across well here. Shapiro Keats is voiced wonderfully by Norio Wakamoto, who would later voice Cell, M. Bison, and Alexander fucking Anderson.
If anyone does not love the Lord, Jesus Christ, let him be accused, O Lord, come, amen.
He brings a very cold and calculated feel to the villain, and it works really well as a foil to the hot-blooded nature of the Cyber Beast Force. Now, sadly, there is an elephant in the room that I need to address, and no, this one is not the robotic one that's part of Dancouga. The animation of this show is ridiculously inconsistent. You can tell that they really did not budget very well when it came to this show. There are some episodes that have solid animation for a show from the 80s with great battle scenes and just all around looks great, right? But the next episode will be chock full of still shots or missing animation frames, which end up making the entire episode feel jank as fuck. It's especially frustrating considering how dark the subject matter can be. The storyline is very engaging at points, but when the animation is as bad as it can be in some episodes, it takes you out of the experience to the point where you're just laughing at it instead of taking it seriously. Just goes to show you that it's always good to have your budget evened out instead of throwing a bunch of money in one area and ignoring another. Before we get into spoiler time, last thing that I'll say is that I hesitantly recommend Dancouga. This is a show with ridiculously high highs, but it also has ridiculously low lows. If you're not somebody who is used to the quirks of retro anime, you're probably going to have a hard time getting through this show. The rough spots all seem to be in the middle as well, which can really bring the whole experience to a dead fucking halt. However, if you can power through that, what you're going to find is a terrific television show that just has rough edges. From what I understand, the OVA films don't have these problems and are really good, but sadly I just haven't had the chance to watch them yet. Either way, if the downsides that I mentioned don't really deter you from it, you're going to enjoy your time with the show and understand why it's considered a classic. It really does go hard in a way that a lot of shows around the time didn't do so outside of Gundam, or just a Tomino production. Alright, it is time for spoilers. So, if the show sounds interesting, go watch it now, then come back to this point later, because I want to discuss some of the themes that are present within the show, and whether or not I feel like they were properly utilized. Alright, you've been warned, and I don't have a particular busty woman to help me illustrate the point that it's spoiler time, so let's just do this. If there's any one thing that Dancouga really excels at, it's that it doesn't insult the intelligence of the audience. It's presenting everything exactly how you would expect it to be presented. There's not a single character in this show that acts in a way that you wouldn't expect them to, given the scenario that's going on. This is a war. Characters get stressed out, go days upon days without sleep, which in a couple scenarios almost kills someone, and everyone is having a hard time processing exactly how to act in this particular scenario. Even though each of the 4 pilots in the Cyber Beast Force are very capable pilots that are very well trained, none of them have experience in armed conflict. The whole shebang is new to them, and that's not even adding an alien invasion on top of it. One particular example that I'm a fan of is an episode where Shinobu finds a young girl who is grieving over the body of her mother. In one of the more heartwarming moments in the series, he goes out of his way to make sure that this little girl will be able to bury her mom and lay her to rest before going and helping his comrades in a fight. The problem is that Shinobu, by doing this, put all of his teammates at risk. I know a lot of soldiers out there. All but 2 of my high school friends enlisted in the service and fought in either Iraq or Afghanistan, if not both. My dad also served in the army around Vietnam, though he never saw combat. But the thing is, knowing the way that those guys are all trained, every single one of them would have prioritized the safety of the civilian that's still alive and not worried about the dead body. However, that's because all of those soldiers that I know are very practical people, many of whom were under fire. In fact, the only one I can think of that wasn't was my dad. My dad's just a hard ass. But anyway, they're not what I would call emotional. Shinobu is quite the opposite. He has a very strong moral center and is very rebellious by his nature, so it's a common theme you find with him that he just bucks orders to try and do the right thing. Or what he feels is right, I should say. He's not always correct, which is another thing that makes him human. There are some times he's going to get into arguments with leadership that you, as the viewer, are going to agree with the leadership 120%. But, again, that makes for human situations. None of these characters are Gary Stews or something like that. They fuck up. They make mistakes. Specifically, now that I think about it, the interactions between him and General Igor, who is the man behind the Cyber Beast Force, are always interesting because Igor butts heads with these guys in a very natural way because he is a seasoned soldier and they're just not. The other thing I'm really happy about is that the show never really pulled the trigger on having Sarah just get over Shapiro and getting into a relationship with Shinobu. Now, there is very much belligerent sexual tension between the two of them. You can tell that at some point after this is all over, the two are going to have a yelling spat between each other, and they're just going to fuck. It's just going to happen. That's their relationship. But the show doesn't do that during the course of the show. The show realizes that part of the intrigue that's going to happen is what happens when Shapiro and Sarah see each other again. They want you to be held on that moment. When she finally sees him again, there's a very tense scene where you wonder whether or not she can actually pull the trigger and kill this guy. You end up wondering exactly what's going to be the downfall of these particulars because, let's be honest, it's very hard to give up on someone you loved, no matter what the circumstances. It makes the whole scenario feel that much more plausible to the audience. Now, one thing that I'll warn people about is if you're coming into this particular show expecting the moral complications of Mobile Suit Gundam, it doesn't really go that far. There's no feasible way to see the alien invaders as anything but assholes. They gladly murder civilians, they gladly commit atrocities, and they ultimately only see humanity as something to be stomped on. There's a very clear good guy, bad guy scenario. Now, the positive thing is that the show focuses on just being an entertaining romp, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. Every once in a while, it's good to indulge in something that exists just to be fun. I'm not of the opinion that every story needs to have some sort of deep moral complications to be good. Some of the best stories ever told have very clear good guys and bad guys. Now, the show never got an English dub, so if you're like me and you don't like looking at subtitles, that's really your only option when it comes to watching this show. Still, I would say it's worth suffering through. You can watch it any way you choose, but the one main way that people watch it is on Verve or Crunchyroll. So if you're looking for something to enjoy a bowl of popcorn with, this particular mecha is right up your alley. Not to mention, given how they have a show with a great cast of characters on top of really good interpersonal drama and character interaction, it's a show that honestly has something for everyone. Check it out, because you won't be disappointed. If you enjoyed this review, do not forget to hit that like button, leave a comment if you've seen it before, to discuss spoilers if you want to, or what have you. But subscribe to the channel if you haven't already as well. Also, once again, if you enjoy this content, go over to Patreon, Subscribestar, grab one of the tiers that are there so you can support us, so we can help keep Shirt Dude in, shirts, I guess. You get what I mean. Anyway, also, if you like comic books and you like horror, go over to Indiegogo.com right now to check out 3 Nights, 4 Days, Part 2. We are on the road to getting that book to $15,000. Once we get there, we're going to have an alternate cover available for everybody as well, so snag it soon. We are less than $500 away. On that note, guys, I appreciate all of you for watching this. My name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. Have yourselves a great rest of your day.